everyone. Good afternoon. It's very nice to be here as your MC. Welcome to this very special lunch, and I hope lunch was great. Was it good? And I hope that you're all now very sleepy and paying attention to me, because that's perfect. We're holding off on dessert just to get your attention. Welcome to this very special luncheon to celebrate the second annual International Day of the Tropics and to launch the State of the Tropics Focus Report on Sustainable Infrastructure in the Tropics. My name is Anita Kapoor, and I'm very happy to be your MC today. We've come together today to hear from a number of people with experience, expertise, and knowledge from across the tropics in governance, policy, environment, health, and international relations. Please join me in warmly welcoming our very special guests today. Dame Carol Kidu, former PNG politician, passionate humanitarian, and social justice advocate. His Excellency Bruce Gosper, Australian High Commissioner to Singapore. Distinguished Professor William Lawrence, James Cook University, also Director of 2 research centres. Dr. Effie Espino, Director of Research Support and Country Engagement of the Asia-Pacific Malaria Elimination Network. And Professor Sandra Harding, Vice-Chancellor and President of James Cook University and convener of the State of the Tropics Project. Welcome to you all. And of course, we are also joined today by academics, business leaders, diplomats, and thinkers. And I just want to tell you all that we are streaming live to special events in Cairns, Townsville, and Mount Isa in Australia, so stomachs in everyone. And we are being streamed online across the world. So welcome to all of our viewers from around the world. A warm welcome here to Singapore. I would also like to thank the Australian Government's Australian ASEAN Council for supporting this event today. The Australian ASEAN Council works to enhance awareness, understanding, and links between the people and institutions of ASEAN and Australia. We'd also like to take this opportunity to thank the institutions involved in the leadership group of the State of the Tropics Project, Nanyang Technological University, Singapore, Organization for Tropical Studies, Costa Rica, Mahidol University, Thailand, the University of Hawaii, USA, University of the South Pacific, Fiji, ESPOL, Ecuador, University of Papua New Guinea, University of Nairobi, Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, and INPA, Brazil. And of course, the National University of Singapore, who provided assistance with the inaugural State of the Tropics report. I know that you might be hashtagging, tweeting, sending out photos. I just want to let everybody know that the hashtags for today are State of the Tropics and We Are the Tropics. So let's talk about the tropics. We live here, we thrive here. The tropics is home to more than 40% of the world's population, and importantly, more than 55% of the world's children. What that tells us is that the very future of our planet depends on what happens in this special region around the equator. On June 29th, 2016, the United Nations celebrated the first ever International Day of the Tropics. The date marks the launch 2 years earlier to the date, of the inaugural State of the Tropics 2014 report. This landmark report, the result of an international collaboration between leading research institutions from around the world's tropical zone, offers a different perspective on the world. It demonstrates that the tropics is a geopolitical and environmental entity in its own right, and highlights the increasing importance of the region and the global implications of the immense social, economic, and environmental changes the tropics are experiencing. A new global dynamic was revealed in the pages of that report. Today we are here to launch another report, a report that builds on the work of the State of the Tropics Project and dives deep into the issues surrounding sustainable infrastructure in the tropics. The development of sustainable, resilient, and inclusive infrastructure lies at the heart of addressing the region's most significant challenges. As the world heads towards 9.5 billion people by mid-century, and races towards an urban future, feeding the world's population, meeting its housing needs, providing energy and access to basic services for all, to help drive economic prosperity and meet communities' needs, while ensuring environmental sustainability and limiting the impacts of climate change, requires investment, innovation, and inclusive approaches to infrastructure development. Now, you all have a copy of the report in front of you, so rather than go into the details about the findings of the report here, I encourage you to please take a look at the key messages to see where we are with infrastructure in the tropics, where we're going, and where we want to be. I would now like to begin proceedings by introducing Professor Sandra Harding, Vice Chancellor and President of James Cook University, to officially welcome you. Sandra, if you would please.
Thank you, Anita, and thanks to you all, particularly our esteemed speakers today, for being here to help us launch the second ever report providing important insight into the state of the tropics. As you heard, today marks 3 years to the day that the first State of the Tropics report was launched. On that occasion, Nobel laureate Aung San Suu Kyi did us the very great honour of launching the inaugural report, with special events in Myanmar, Singapore, Australia, pick up around the world. Today we return to Singapore, this extraordinary tropical island nation, to launch the first focus report from the State of the Tropics project, a focus report exploring the development of sustainable infrastructure in the tropics, as Anita described. My role today is very simple. It is to add my very warm welcome to everyone here today and to those watching in Cairns, Townsville, Mount Isa and across the world online, and to those celebrating the International Day of the Tropics in their own way. In particular, I want to acknowledge those involved in a gala event in Costa Rica organised by the Organisation for Tropical Studies, one of the State of the Tropics project's partners. You heard from Anita about the important role the United Nations has played in declaring the 29th of June as the International Day of the Tropics. The United Nations has a dedicated webpage celebrating this day, celebrating today, and providing information on the importance of the tropics and the interplay between the tropics and the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. It's well worth a look. Well, that's enough for me. Again, many thanks for your attendance today and for your interest in what is the most dynamic zone of the world as we further explore and define the state of the tropics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Harding. I would now like to introduce our very special keynote speaker. Growing up in the suburbs of Brisbane, Australia in the 1950s, Dame Carol had no idea she would one day become one of the most highly respected and influential people in Papua New Guinea. Her life was transformed when she met her future husband, Buri Kidu, a young boy on a scholarship from Papua New Guinea on a school camp. Defying social norms of the time, Carol and Buri married and relocated to Port Moresby. Carol was first elected to Parliament in 1997 in Papua New Guinea as the member for Port Moresby South. She went on to serve 15 years in PNG politics and for the last 10 was the only woman in the 109-member Papua New Guinea Parliament. She served her final political role as leader of the opposition. During her time in Parliament, Dame Carol championed integrated community development policies and, with a passion for marginalised groups, she was committed to transforming legislative and policy frameworks for social development. In 2005, Dame Carol was made Dame Commander of the British Empire and in 2009 was made a Knight of the Legion d'Honneur by France for her commitment to helping marginalised groups such as women, children, people with disabilities, people with HIV and LGBTI groups. Dame Carol was also recognised in 2007 for her efforts to combat poverty, domestic violence and child abuse, when Island Business magazine named her Pacific Person of the Year. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a very warm welcome to Dame Carol Kidu.
In my husband's language, I say, Dina tu buai namona ibo muiai. Good middle of the day to all of you. I feel very nervous, but I will settle down, I assure you. I am extremely honoured to be here for the International Day of the Tropics and to be given the honour of launching the State of the Tropics Report 2017. I thank JCU for affording me this privilege and add my greetings to those who are watching live stream, including some of my grandchildren, I believe, who are going to dance in Cairns. Although an honour, it's rather daunting to address this audience of academics and business people and highly qualified people. My presentation will be based on my lived experiences and my subjective interpretation of those experiences, not on an academic research, and so I put that as a caveat. And of course, my reflections are from Papua New Guinea, but I would like to just let us look at that map first of all. I was going to do the Pacific in general, but it is just too large, too much. I've been cutting. And if you look at that, the Pacific Ocean is 1/3 of the area of the world, an area that is going to be an area for the future, but I've had to leave out the new movement for the Pacific Oceanscape. I'm privileged to be here, not because of my own qualifications, but because of many people and my gratitude to them. My late mother-in-law and the people of Pari village for teaching me to live in another world, and the people of Moresby South who gave me the privilege of being a politician for 15 years. They don't enjoy just such privileges as this, and I always acknowledge them when I travel internationally, because I'm here because of them. I wouldn't be here otherwise. What is development? You know, it's really been grappling with this whole enormity of the topic. And I looked at the Burnett Institute, some summary things when I was looking at some health statistics. It all became quite overwhelming. There are so many aspects to development. And so I decided to look just present at some snapshots. So I'm going to try to just do some snapshots and not to do anything really comprehensive. And those are the snapshots that I'm going to try to look at. A couple of case studies, thinking about sustainability and the power of partnerships. And then we will have the great thing of today, launching of the report. So rethinking sustainable development. My whole talk today is based on an underlying premise. In many parts of Papua New Guinea, the introduced socio-economic, religious, and cultural paradigms are just a thin veneer over a multitude of traditional cultural psychologies and lifestyles. Research about the changing social infrastructure and its impact on development is needed. And in many parts today, I would say research is needed because we are amongst academics and researchers. Research is needed to underpin and guide policy and legislative interventions for equitable and sustainable development. This photograph of Hanawabada village, a traditional Motu village, but with modern odds and sods of materials in the foreground, and the city of Port Moresby, quite an old one. The city of Port Moresby's changed quite a bit since I took this photo. It really illustrates that the concept of two worlds of tradition and modernity. But within those two worlds, there are now many worlds based on different tribal psychologies and Western urban culture. It's a very complex social infrastructure, creating increasing social disintegration, which I believe personally, because I'm on the human infrastructure side, is one of the biggest challenges we are facing in Papua New Guinea at present. It is such a difficult socio-cultural environment for sustainable and equitable development to occur, and we can see the inequity increasing. As a politician in such a complex social environment, I was constantly trying to analyze the cause and effect relationships of the successes and failures, more failures, I think, than successes, but they were learning experiences in my development efforts. But who am I? In my birth family, I was an individual, Carol. In my marriage into a Motu family, I'm not Carol. I have never been called Carol by my relatives. I am defined in terms of my relationships with other people and the expected behavior and obligations that go with those relationships. I am Buri Vabuna, Buri's widow. I am Dobi Sinana, Dobi's mother. I am Taboro Ravana, Taboro's in-law. I am so on, so on, so on. I'm never Carol. I am defined in terms of my relationship with other people. To assume that PNG is a predictable in PNG, a predictable logical process, and ignore the influence of relationships can result in very disappointing development outcomes. The importance of the unpredictable nature of relationships should be factored into theory of change models, but rarely is. In fact, I often laugh when people tell me, you must write a theory of change model. I said, the only theory of change I can give you is that it's unpredictable. We are the land of the unexpected, but this is what's expected. Another interesting concept that if you're working in PNG or the Pacific is the Pacific leadership dilemma, development dilemma. Most societies still in the rural areas, not the urban. Urban, of course, is changing rapidly, and so are the rural gradually. But there are three leadership influences: the faith of the church, the government, the councils, etc., and the culture, the chiefs, etc., the land chiefs, and so on. And these things, if you're going to do development, you need to negotiate with them all. In a typical development paradigm, the government is at the top, but that will not necessarily be the case if you work in Papua New Guinea or in the Pacific. The government may not be at the top. And these leadership dilemmas can create a sustainable development dilemmas on how you can get sustainable development if you don't negotiate with all the leaders in the triangle, if you are in a situation where it exists. For me, and obviously I was the Minister for Community Development, it was my passion and still is. For sustainable and inclusive development, the key is in the community. And that is a very difficult thing, actually. Families and communities must have the opportunities to take ownership of development and build their communities from inside out. Build from, adapt, and enhance traditional resilience. Too often we take in solutions, but the development industry has moved on, and now more and more, I'm so pleased with what I'm seeing, that we are realizing that imposed situations don't work. Now, I'm using an illustration like this. I know you're extremely academic, but I do them for a purpose too. When we talk about inclusive development, we talk a lot about gender, we talk about disability, we talk about HIV, we talk about marginalized groups, etc. Very rarely do we talk about the large number of illiterate people. So I use illustrations a lot. I used to use a lot in my own electorate. So people who are illiterate can sit and talk around a drawing. So I'm not trying to treat you like children, I'm sorry. This is the way I work, because I think we must always remember, not in this room, but in Papua New Guinea, almost half the people are still illiterate. And I'm sure it's similar in many tropical nations. So for sustainable development, it requires change. It requires change from dependency to re-empowerment. And I say re-empowerment deliberately. Traditionally, people were empowered. And I think it's very insulting to say, we've got to empower you. People were empowered, and they lived very resilient lives. But they certainly now need re-empowerment in new skills, new knowledge, so that they can be part of the modern world, and they want that. And we're going to need the infrastructure of IT infrastructure to help leapfrog people forward. I don't believe it's going to happen automatically in Papua New Guinea unless we use the IT infrastructure to help leapfrog forward. It's happening. It's already happening, but not necessarily for educational purposes. And so that's where we need to make it become so. So I'm kind of lost. During my political career, there were constant demands for development from my constituency. But development was mostly seen as a product, a bridge, a water pump, something, with very little attention being given to the processes, ownership, and management systems for sustainability. And when you're a politician, you're expected to deliver, We want action, we don't want words. It's a very difficult, conflicting situation to be in when you know very well when you deliver, and don't attend to all the processes of management, etc., often it will fail. And I could give plenty of examples. It's really important to always remember that sustainability is a social process as much as an economic process, and is based on cultural understanding and cultural relevance. Okay, let's move on to a couple of case studies. This one is about water and sanitation projects, and I particularly like it. In fact, I'm going to be doing a studio with the SAGO network later in my own, where I live. It's not my land, it's my son's, and it's customary land, with this group, because I've been impressed by their work. They work as community-centred design and development, often design, build, focus on water sanitation programs, and hold social sustainability as high as ecological sustainability. And this informs the project process with community at the centre of our thinking always. There's always basic principles before they work in a community, which all of the researchers in this room would know and already practice. Exploring how community-centred design and development can benefit the other 90%, and trying to make sure we include that other 90%, the women, marginalised groups, the illiterate, etc., and contribute to holistic, socially sustainable community development in Papua New Guinea. The programs often commence with village members casting their votes and deciding the priorities, rather than someone else deciding their priorities. Design and planning construction phases always involve the community using classrooms. And construction phases are always collaborative with professional team working alongside the community members. First area of water, only 33% of the population of rural Papua New Guinea have access to improved water source. In fact, I am about half an hour out from Port Moresby and I don't have any running water. I carry my water every day from Port Moresby in little drums in the back of a utility. Water is quite an issue in Papua New Guinea. Luckily, we do have high rainfall in many areas. With 3.5 of every 1,000 children under 5 years old dying from diarrhoea, and over 13% of children under 6 years old having diarrheal disease at any one time, there is a dire need to improve access to clean water throughout Papua New Guinea. Although I don't have running water, at least I can collect running water in town and carry it out to where I live. So water is a big focus, and with water, it's community. Getting the community involved so that they can build, design, and manage. I put in quite a number of water pumps in my electorate, but I didn't do it properly. And several of them, individuals took ownership. Another one, the youth got drunk and broke the handle because they didn't like me politically, all sorts of things. I needed the SAGO network at the time. Hopefully their water pumps and things will not suffer the same as some of the ones I put in did during my political career. Sanitation. My husband's village is right in NCD, the city of Port Moresby. Its sanitation is like that. Or inside the house, a hole in the floor over the water, and children all swim in the water under the house. Sanitation is another key challenge facing PNG's communities, with 59% of the rural population, or approximately 3.3 million people, living without access to formal sanitation. The causal link between informal sanitation practices and illness is well established, and dysentery and stomach illness accounts for 9% of all deaths under the age of 5 years, unnecessary deaths. So they've been focusing on trying to work on composting toilets. In fact, the architectural studio work that I'm going to do on the land we live on, probably at the end of this year, we're now planning it, we're going to do the toilet one. People in the community, and this, of course, it has to be family-based. I was involved in a project that did do community toilets, a disaster. It wasn't actually my project, but it was a disaster. Nobody took responsibility for the cleanliness or hygiene of the toilets. So this one is based on families, just families having to be willing to work towards putting money in to help do it. And they're composting toilets. I'm really interested in this technology. Okay, let's go from that one, that's on-the-ground NGO work, to research studies, which JCU is doing so much work in as well. I'm the patron of the Healthy Mothers, Healthy Babies initiative in Papua New Guinea, so I chose to do a little bit on that. Again, James Cook is trying to address the problem that the SAGO network is addressing, the 90-10 mismatch. Low and middle income countries represent 90% of the world's burden of preventable mortality. Most are tropical countries. Less than 10% of the global health research expenditure, I'm sure James Cook would be well aware of this, was spent on health problems affecting low and middle income countries, and most of which are tropical countries. So there is this real mismatch here, and that's from the Commission on Health Research for Development. Very interesting, Healthy Mothers, Healthy Babies. We have very high maternal mortality, infant mortality, newborn mortality rates, and so that it's doing a longitudinal tracking, not just at the time, but tracking a whole cohort of women and their babies over a long period of time. And I think they're going to do a 5-year checkup too after that. The field methods are as one would expect and as would be used by JCU. Always consultation, working on the systems, not just bringing a project in, but aim to improve the systems of any country that you're in. It's a big worry for me that I feel our systems are really breaking down because there's such a focus on politics in Papua New Guinea, and the political leader has such power that the systems are breaking down. And so focusing with the provincial health people, the national health people, always training local people to take over and getting out into the really remote rural areas for this project. Then there's a home-based management of malaria. We're trying to develop practical, effective health solutions that improve health equity. Access to rapid diagnostic testing and treatment saves lives, empowers community, and improves health outcomes for the whole population. And training people to do the rapid testing, training people within communities, and there's a whole team of them. And I don't have anything on the RID TB. I didn't have time to sort out photos on that, but some interesting work being done in Papua New Guinea on the TB crisis that we're going through at present with drug-resistant TB. So, where do we go? There's lots and lots of good initiatives. There's lots of good things, but we have to have the power of partnerships to maximize impact. Actually, government needs to actively facilitate these partnerships. Government needs to put itself in the driving seat, but it doesn't always happen. We need these partnerships to be 3 ways: bottom up, the whole community ownership issue, community capacity building; the top-down, rights-based, legal policy implementation, budget frameworks. And that's where we go wrong. We have lots of good policies. I was a prolific policy person when I was a minister, because I took on an area that had no policies: early childhood, disability, this, that. But trying to get the budgets to implement, that was another matter altogether. So it's got to be budgets to implement policies. And, of course, the very important part of the outside in, the research agencies, the development agencies, private sector, etc. We talk about PPP, the public-private partnership, but I'm always saying, no, we need PCPP or CPPP or whatever you want to call it. We need a public-community-private partnership. We cannot leave the community out of the partnership. Otherwise, we're doomed to have mixed results. So the challenge is making it happen. Development is a process, not a product. You should hear the community discussions around that cartoon. Really, really incredible community discussions when you facilitate them. The process needs teamwork to make it happen, and needs more women to be given the opportunity to paddle the decision-making and development canoe at the highest level. And that's a big challenge in the Pacific. We are the worst region in the world in terms of women's representation in political decision-making. So what are we all going to do? You are already doing it. We can make choices, and I'm sure you experience this. I do that too often. And I tend to be doing that more often nowadays. I'd rather pretend things didn't happen. But in the end, we have to all get involved and make it happen, like JCU has been doing, and like the UN has done with the International Day for the Tropics. So we're now going to get involved and make it happen with launching of this report, which is fresh off the printers. I couldn't see it beforehand. I've only just seen it when I walked in here. And I'm going to ask, because I never launch anything by myself, because everything is teamwork. Nobody, right? So I'll ask Sandra, please. and Mark and Anne to come out here. I believe you were key features. And anyone else who was part of this work, please come out and let's talk about the importance of this report. Thank you. This report is extremely important. Evidence-based development is critical for success. And it's extremely important this report gets into the offices of every politician in the region throughout the tropics, because they are the ones who make the policies that determine our future. So I can't overemphasize the importance of this report, the state of the Pacific, the state of the tropics. I'm a bit biased, aren't I? The state of the tropics 2017. And all of you, please make sure you get it into the hands of the policymakers. On behalf of all those who actually were responsible for this very impressive document, I now officially launch the State of the Tropics 2017 and congratulate JCU.
Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, a big thank you once again for that fascinating and enlightening speech. Please join me in thanking Dame Carol Kidu. As I was listening to Dame Carol speak, the line that actually really came home to me was traditionally people were empowered and live resilient lives, and re-empowerment is needed. From dependency, we move to re-empowerment. And I was just thinking in terms of the tropics at large, and I think philosophers and colonialists could not quite come to terms with the fact that the tropics was never ever going to be either predictable or logical. And that's exactly the charm. And of course, change is the constant. And I think in looking at the slides and listening to some of the challenges and some of the progresses, and PNG is reflective of much that is happening in the tropics that needs our sustained attention to move from the varied dependencies that exist in different thresholds in different countries to re-empowerment and sustainability of growth. Wow, what a way to begin, huh? I hope everyone's really sharp now. That's fantastic. Thank you very much once again, Dame Carol Kidu. We now move on to the next part of the event, where 3 world experts discuss in detail the role that infrastructure and development in the tropics plays across the environment, health, and trade and investment. I will hand over chairing duties in just a moment to Andrew Chu from James Cook University of Singapore, but just a little introduction to Andrew first. He comes from a background in financial consulting and auditing and has worked in education and training for several years. He is the current member of the Australian Chamber of Commerce in Singapore and the Marketing Institute of Singapore. Please welcome Andrew on stage. He's going to moderate this, and he's going to bring with him the panelists, and I'm going to introduce each of the panelists to you at the same time. His Excellency Bruce Gosper is the Australian High Commissioner to Singapore. Before becoming head of mission in Singapore, he was the CEO of Austrade, the Australian government agency responsible for promoting trade, investment in international education and tourism, policy programs, and research. His career has included serving as ambassador and permanent representative to the World Trade Organization, and he has held high-level diplomatic positions in Washington and Tokyo. He's joined by Dr. Effie Espino, who is the recently appointed Director of Research, Support, and Country Engagement of the Asia-Pacific Malaria Elimination Network. She has been involved in research in malaria, dengue, and neglected parasitic infectious diseases for more than 25 years at Research Institute of Tropical Medicine of the Philippines Department of Health. She's also worked for several years in the World Health Organization, sponsored clinical trials for malaria and visceral leishmaniasis, got it, amongst others, in Bangladesh, China, India, Kenya, Tanzania, and Thailand. Most recently, she established the Research Institute of Tropical Medicine as a World Health Organization-supported regional training center for good health research practices for the Western Pacific region. And we also have with us our third panelist, William Lawrence, a distinguished research professor and Australian laureate at James Cook University in Cairns, a tropical environmental scientist scientist. He has written 8 books and over 600 scientific and popular articles. He is a fellow of the Australian Academy of Science and has received many professional honours, amongst them the Heineken Environment Prize, BBVA Frontiers in Conservation Biology Award, and the Society for Conservation Biology's Distinguished Service Award. His research focuses on the impacts of intensive land uses, such as habitat fragmentation, logging, hunting, and wildfires, on tropical forests and their biodiversity. He is also interested in protected areas, climatic change, the impact of roads and other infrastructure on biodiversity, and conservation policy. Ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome to our panelists. I now hand you over to Andrew to moderate this session. Andrew, if you would please.
Thank you, Anita, for the introductions, and good afternoon to everyone. It's really my honor today to moderate such a distinguished panel with expertise in a diverse array of fields. And we're going to have a conversation today about the role that infrastructure and development plays in the tropics across a range of areas, namely the environment, health, and trade and investment. And we're going to talk about the challenges and opportunities, as well as the outlook for the tropics. The session will take around about 40 minutes. And if we do have sufficient time at the end, I will open the floor to questions from the audience. Now, as defined by, I think that's a bit better, I think people at the back can hear me now. Now, as defined by the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which Professor Harding made reference to, providing sustainable infrastructure will be essential to achieving the world's target for sustainable development and ending poverty by 2030. So I wanted to begin with Mr. Gosper and have him talk about what he believes is the most important development challenge for the tropics in relation to achieving the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals.
Well, thanks very much, Andrew. And I guess there are a range of issues I could talk about. Well, I mean, one of the things I might mention at the front is 40% of the world's population is in the tropics, and 40% of Australia is in the tropics as well. So it's only 1 million people, but it's a sizable piece of land, almost 3 million square kilometres. And there's a range of issues there which intersect with our broader issue with the tropics and the things that we'll talk about. So there's a lot of things to address there around hard infrastructure, but also soft infrastructure. And that's partly what's leading us to invest so deeply in issues that are relevant to the tropics, issues around tropical health, for instance, but many other areas as well. And then, of course, our region, Southeast Asia, has a big demand there. There are a lot of issues which come about because of being in the tropics. Issues around disease outbreaks, drug resistance, issues around natural disasters and health emergencies of one sort or another. So that also, of course, is a very important context for us. Southeast Asia, ASEAN, is a very important part of the globe for us, not just from a humanitarian and moral perspective, but also because it's the part of the world in which we live, and we want to see prosperity and security flourish. And there are issues to develop that come about because of its place in the world, and because of the consequences of being part of the tropics.
Great, thanks for that. Yeah, there's definitely quite a few issues at hand there, and I'm not sure whether Professor Lawrence would like to add your thoughts. Professor Lawrence, maybe you'd also like to share a bit about the work that you're currently involved in as well.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Just get me started on infrastructure, and I sort of need a soapbox, I think, to stand up on top of. Infrastructure there's a good reason why we're here talking about infrastructure today. Of course, we're living really in the most profound era of infrastructure expansion in human history, in Earth's history. Just a couple of examples. The developed nations of Asia will see the road infrastructure double in the next 3 years. By the middle part of this century, we're expected to have about another 25 million kilometers of new paved roads on the Earth. Would be enough to go around the Earth more than 600 times. There's about 4,000 major hydroelectric dams that are being built or planned or under construction at the moment. Everywhere you look, you see different kinds of infrastructure: mining, oil and gas, communication infrastructure, energy infrastructure, water infrastructure, transportation infrastructure. It is changing the planet in every sense, and economically, environmentally, socially. There's no realm of human experience right now that is not being profoundly affected by this tsunami of infrastructure. Now, I guess if I were going to say one thing about our work, so for about 35 years now, we've been working in Latin America and in the Asia Pacific and in Africa, almost entirely in developing countries, on issues around land use change and infrastructure, but we look broadly. We're environmental scientists fundamentally, but we've also found that we've very quickly had to become, in some sense, economists, social scientists, even in a very poor sense, politicians, because these decisions are being made so rapidly and so profoundly. I guess I would just say this, and I'll throw one thing out. I would put it to you that while we keep hearing again and again and again that we need infrastructure, that many circumstances, many nations, many communities direly need infrastructure, we need huge investment in infrastructure, it's critical, it's important. I would also put it to you that many of the infrastructure projects that are happening right now are oftentimes not well conceived, they're not well designed, they're not being properly motivated, and they have high risks of losing assets, of squandering access to resources, of benefiting the many at the cost of the few in some cases, at leading to greater social disenfranchisement than they should do. And so we are not anti-development, but we is smart development. And quite frankly, what we see is many cases where infrastructure projects, nations have a finite amount of resources that they can put into infrastructure, and in many cases, in some cases, that infrastructure is not going in the way that's going to have the greatest economic and social impact, while simultaneously also trying to reduce and lessen the environmental costs. And we can talk at length as to why that's happening, a lot of things that are involved in that, but the bottom line is this: not all infrastructure is good infrastructure. In fact, I would say that we really need to think critically. Investors, multilateral banks, donors, others that are involved, corporations, others involved in infrastructure, we need to talk about risk, reputational risk, financial risk, social risk, all kinds of risks, because a number of these projects are not lining up to produce the kind of benefits in which they're being sold. And I think we need to be cautious about buying into these uncritically. If we don't, I think there are going to be a lot of people that are disappointed, and there's going to be this very significant possibility of a lot of stranded assets, which unfortunately we really can't afford right now.
Yeah, thanks for that. I like the concept of smart development. Do you have an example that you could share with the audience? An example of smart development?
Sure. What we would oftentimes argue is the best places to put roads, new roads, or to improve the roads, are to put them into places where you've got concentrations. In fact, if we look around many developing countries, what you see is that there's large areas of land that have predominantly been settled already. You've got relatively large human populations, but in fact, the agriculture in many of those areas is still underperforming relative to what it could. With better agricultural technologies, with better cultivars, with better access to fertilizers, irrigation, other kinds of things, and also critically, better access to rapidly growing urban markets, those rural farmers can get a lot more profit and a lot more productivity from their farming, and they can also attract a lot more rural investment. That's what we would call smart development. The ducks line up, you're in the right circumstances to realize a lot of investment, a lot of return on your investment. What would not be a good investment would be punching a road out into the middle of a wild area where where there's probably actually very limited political support for that, but it might be, say, to connect a village what happens to be, perhaps one example would be the cousin of the prime minister, and a pledge was made, and so a large investment is going into producing that road, which would lead to large-scale deforestation, poaching, land speculation, other kinds of destabilizing processes, colonization, things that would be upsetting the residents living in the area. So many examples of smart development and not so smart
So
development.
really taking into consideration sort of the triple bottom line, society, the economy, and environmental considerations as well. Yep. Thanks for that. Dr. Espino, any perspective from particularly a health view?
Well, yes, I think health is an outcome of development. You can actually measure how good a development is by looking at health indicators. I come from, I'm a medical doctor, and my training was mainly clinical. It was only when I started working for government that I realized that the medical training that we have in school did not prepare me for a public health career. And it's very interesting the way the report talks about infrastructure. You have hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure. And I agree with that with Bill, that it's good. It's very good. It's actually what good and smart infrastructure is what we need in a country in the Philippines. However, we just have to be careful the way this infrastructure is made, because sometimes urbanization would be a hard infrastructure, am I correct? Or even an ecotourism development. But what happens with that, and we've seen quite events happening in the Philippines, that you lose now the interface between because if a community develops naturally, you have this interface between the environment and the human residents. What happens in some infrastructure development, this interface is lost. And I think that is where the problems start. You get resurgence of infectious diseases, you have disease outbreaks, an example is although most of my work has been in malaria, we've seen malarious areas in the Philippines. Because of development, we lose malaria, but then we get dengue, chikungunya. So it's making that very fine balance work.
Thanks for that. As well as illuminating the tropical infrastructure deficit, this report demonstrated a lack of capacity in terms of skilled workers and researchers in the tropics. So Dr. Espino, how do we build this capacity in the tropics and encourage our best and brightest to remain?
Very good question. You'd have to look at it from different perspectives. Let's say in public health programs, the workforce, because let's say vector-borne diseases, an example is vector-borne diseases. There has been a lot of development in that area, new tools, new interventions, and a lot of innovations. And in this rush to develop these new tools and interventions, we tend to forget the human aspect of this. Of this. An example is malaria rapid diagnostic tests. Malaria rapid diagnostic test makes use of a cassette, like what you use when you want to test your blood sugar, and it can be easily done by a community health worker. It took quite a while to develop the instructions for a volunteer community health worker to do this. So we had to do training there, so that's one level of training. The other training is when you now want to develop skills for the higher level of the workforce, let's say your middle managers. Let's say for the Philippines, we lack management training for doctors who actually manage a rural health facilities. I don't know if maybe Carol must have seen this in Papua New Guinea. Because in some countries where you have a decentralized or devolved health system structure, the rural health physician actually manages a health facility which looks at the health of 50,000 people, but they don't have that skill. One thing good about this is that there are now medical schools in the Philippines which offer these courses within the medical school program. I think you even have it here in Singapore, looking at the management skills. So, and the other area would be now in the research And I think that's sorely lacking for countries in the tropical areas. If you do a review of the malaria research, you'll find out that most of them are published by developed countries. You see very little output from Pacific. Actually, very little is known about the malaria in this region.
I hear what you're saying. The software is equally important. Yes. Yeah. Mr. Gosper, your views?
Well, I think obviously education is tremendously important. It's a demand across the whole spectrum of society and economy in these countries where you have often a demographic bulge. You've got big cohorts of young people who need skills of one sort or another. So effectively doing that is quite important. So we have to make sure our education system is geared to providing skills in a way that is practical and available and cost efficient. So that's one thing the Australian sector is giving its attention to. I mean, we've done other things like set up centres of excellence to look at particular skill sets, including for workers, more skilled workers that have a specific application to the tropical area. So in areas like tropical health or design and architecture that's relevant to the tropics, areas like tropical aquaculture, those sorts of areas. So there's quite a bit going on in that area as well. And then, of course, more specific programs that look at the things that are most troubling in the region as well. So we've set up the Menzies School of Tropical Health Research. We've got a collaborative program on this across the country. So investing significantly more in developing programs and solutions that are available easily and at the right cost in the region for issues that are having tremendous impact on societies and on their effectiveness as societies. So all those sorts of things, I think, go to a significant amount of attention to big parts of the health problem and the skills deficit in the tropics in this region.
Yeah. So access to education and training and developing customized or specialized programs.
Yeah. And taking advantage of, if he was talking about technology, of course, the way access to just a phone can improve things. I mean, and the difference, for instance, a portable ultrasound can make on mortality during childbirth. And it doesn't take a lot of skill, but it takes a little bit of skill and connectivity in the system to address those things. But it is possible. Technology can change a lot in this area.
Yeah. Thanks for that. And Professor Lawrence, any comments from your side?
Sure. Well, other than just really to echo Bruce and Iffy's comments, I mean, the developing nations, and in some cases it's the ones that are perhaps in the most dire need, really do need more expertise. And most of my students come from developing countries, and I can tell you, students say come from Nigeria or Colombia or Papua New Guinea, and they come to Australia and they say, wow, I really like it here, I'm going to look into getting residency. And I say, hang on a second, that wasn't the deal. The deal was you're going home and taking your training with you. Train students there. But I think that one of the things I do know is there are more willing young minds and more students who want to study and want to learn, and what's limiting them is resources. And so I guess in some sense this would be a plea to our governments and our donors and our multilateral groups. And I say as someone who's originally from the United States, it's disturbing to me to see the government there turning much more inward and less outward in its perspective. And I think that we're seeing in some parts of the world alarming perspectives. We need to be reaching out, and we really need to be investing in training. And remembering also that an industrial nation that aids its neighbors in training young people also enhances their stability, the stability of that nation, and builds long-term bridges that undoubtedly will be of broader benefit. So the one thing is, there are a lot of young people out there that want to be trained And what's stopping us and what's limiting us is the resources. We're going everywhere, looking everywhere, and what limits us is just having the funding available.
Now, there are numerous existing initiatives that focus on sustainable development in developing countries. Professor Lawrence, another question for you. And what does a tropical perspective offer that may be different?
Boy, that's a good question too. The tropics, okay, I'm going to have to revert to my fundamental development, which is as a scientist. To me, the tropics are in many ways unique. What we're seeing right now is a juxtaposition of two things. You've got the most ancient and the most biologically rich and the most ecologically complicated ecosystems on the planet that we also know provide us with a whole set of very critical environmental services, everything from carbon storage to regulating flooding to protecting soils, and most crucially, probably driving much of the really critical climatic cycles around moisture and heat on the planet. On the other hand, we also have rapidly growing economies and populations and economic development and changing interests and lifestyles, and of course, a great deal of international attention focusing now as much on the Asia-Pacific region as anywhere. And so what you've really got, I think, is shaping up uniquely tropical is, on the one hand, if it were a game of poker, the stakes couldn't be any higher. On the other hand, we've got so many big and powerful players. We've got some very heavy bettors at the table right now. And I think the stakes are extremely high. The tropics could potentially suffer a great deal environmentally and socially and developmentally, or it could follow a trajectory which is much more benign and much more promising. I do think we're living in many ways in what you might call a decade of decision. Profound changes afoot. Just look at what China's doing, the One Belt, One Road program, the 21st century Silk Road programs. These are world changers. For good or for ill, we don't yet know, but everything is changing, and right now, all the chips are on the table. So I think we want to be paying pretty careful attention to what's going on, and not just hoping for the best, but really, I think, trying to work for the best.
Any other views from the rest of the panel? Yeah. Mr. Cosper?
I think William's put it very well. It is a time of quite significant environmental pressure, and a lot of that's coming about because of the increased urbanisation in the region. But it's also a time of increasing change in populations, and that's a feature of demography. A lot of it's happening here, of accelerated economic growth. This is a region, and I'm talking here about Southeast Asia, where there's a lot of growth happening still, and that's a welcome thing, of course, for everybody. A lot of middle class, big urbanisation changes, and a lot of technological impact. So that convergence of factors, I think, makes it a very important time to engage on the needs for good policy, for good infrastructure, for infrastructure that's actually money well spent, that increases connectivity and that increases the public good. And that is the real test, of course, as was said earlier around infrastructure, to really base infrastructure in a sound understanding of what will have the best impact for the development of the societies and countries we're talking about.
I'd like to now look at the subject of health, and I've got a few questions for Dr. Espino. Given the tropics has a much higher infectious disease burden than elsewhere, what do you, Dr. Espino, see as the major infrastructure challenges in the tropics related to health?
Yes. Let's take a look at it on a broad way. In the tropics, you see a whole range of countries. You have Malaysia, which is it's a high income country, and then you have Singapore, and then you have Indonesia, Thailand. I think they're more. Indonesia and the Philippines are middle-income countries. On the far end, you have all the developed countries in the tropics, and on the other end, we have countries which are not doing too well, and of which infrastructure is a problem. With this whole range of different types of countries, developed economies of the countries in the tropics, a robust health system is, I think, a challenge in these areas. And it's a health system that can adapt, and it's flexible. It can respond to the changing landscape of infectious diseases. I think this is a very big challenge. We just had a meeting last week where we discussed in the WHO, Western Pacific Region Office for Malaria Surveillance, and we found out that the countries that were present there were about 7 countries there. They had a diverse capacity in dealing with malaria surveillance. And even the health system structure. And can be just something as making diagnosis accessible. We talk, I think, Bill, you mentioned not all roads are of benefit. It depends on the purpose, but there are areas in these countries where, although the governments talk about universal health care, this universal health care is not accessible. You have people who have to walk for 2 hours, 2 hours just to get a diagnosis. So depending on the weather, if it's raining or if the stream turns into a raging river, they're isolated. And this we see as a problem for the vector-borne diseases. And then there is also land use changes, which the health systems do not factor in when they put up their infrastructure, the soft infrastructure. There are a lot of issues and problems with because of it's a complex picture.
You mentioned a few countries there: Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia. Obviously, Indonesia has a much larger population than the other two. Do you see that as a factor in terms of a challenge?
I will refer back again to the meeting that we had. I was very amazed with Malaysia. They really had a good malaria program network. Because we were discussing malaria surveillance for malaria elimination, they already started to think about what to do after we eliminate malaria. So I think it has to do more with good governance. And Carol mentioned a while, there are a lot of policies. It's true, but let's say for the Philippines, we have a lot of policies, but they're not implemented or poorly enforced. So it really is political will and good governance, yeah.
That really leads to my next question, Dr. Espino, and that is, what can cities and communities do from an infrastructure perspective to help eradicate infectious diseases such as malaria and dengue? And can, in fact, these diseases be eradicated?
I'll just dissect that question. Dengue usually occurs in urban. I mean, that's the general belief. It occurs in urban areas, but we are starting to see it in areas or villages which once reported malaria. And this could be because of quite a number of things. One could be because of poor water supply, so people tend to store water. And it also has to do with their livelihood practices. We monitored a case study wherein people in one of the provinces, we probably heard in Palawan, they love to put bamboo as their wall. So these actually serve as breeding sites for the dengue vectors. And the individuals who provide the homes with this bamboo are actually exposed to malaria when they go into the forest to gather these bamboo. It's actually rattan. And the process of curing the rattan for use in the homes actually puts them at risk. So they're at risk when they apply the method, and they are also providers of risk. So I don't think it's a straightforward, there's no straightforward solution. Yeah, and yes.
Okay, thanks for that. The report that was launched today specifies the need to develop sustainable infrastructure that takes into account social, economic, as well as environmental considerations. Professor Lawrence, you have spent most of your life working in tropical rainforests and have seen extensive change during that time. What options do you think are available to balance the social and economic benefits of infrastructure with environmental conservation?
Yes, I think that really is the trick, Andrew. The good news is I actually think we've got a pretty good idea how to max or optimize social and economic developments while at the same time minimizing the environmental costs. I think we've figured that out. The bad news is we're not really implementing it. And it's a little bit like a lot of things. We have the laws or we have the regulations or we know how to do sustainable logging, we just don't do it. So that's where the problem really is. So one of the things that we're doing right now, beat our own drum for a little bit. So for instance, we're working in a number of nations, in many cases in partnership with governments. For instance, we're partnering with the presidential office in Indonesia to help guide development strategies in Papua. And there are places where we think, there's lots of opportunity to realize very significant improvements in food security, agricultural production, rural investment, rural livelihoods, investment in education and rural health, reducing the disparity between the wealth between the urban and the rural populations, promoting, in just essence, overall more sustainable livelihoods. And also, by the way, something that we don't hesitate to mention is if you have a populace in which is seeing these benefits, these are also voters. And so remember, politicians, these people out there seeing these benefits, these broad-based benefits, will vote and probably keep you in office if you follow these general kinds of guidelines. What we don't like to see is large investments in infrastructure that are going to have marginal benefits. Maybe because some individual, shall we say, in a position of influence is realizing some personal gain, or because there are factors there are a whole set of things that can influence and guide infrastructure in ways that we wouldn't necessarily say is the ideal in terms of it would have modest social environmental benefits, it would have high risks, and really potential for serious environmental costs. And the other thing I would say is we see this happening all the time. I'm much more into what you call hard infrastructure than soft infrastructure. We see classically way too much money going in up front, hundreds of millions of kina or dollars or yuan or whatever for a new road, a major new highway, and then not nearly enough money for investment. So what happens? 3 years, 4 years later, a road you're supposed to be able to go 100 kilometers on to get your crops to market, to get your health workers to the rural areas, to do what that major investment, now all of a sudden it's got potholes and slumping and cracks, and you go 40 kilometers an hour, then you stop, and it bottlenecks, and you go 5 kilometers an hour, then you get up to 30 kilometers. You're basically going at an average speed of 15 kilometers an hour. You have squandered that enormous investment, and it's a classical consequence of high rainfall, tropical environments, and almost the large majority of roads are not being properly engineered for these environments. They don't have enough drainage, they don't have enough culverts, they don't have enough road base. We know what to do. We know what to say. We know how to tell the less ambitious schemes in the beginning, more money in long-term investment, better engineering, smarter principles about where you put the roads. We do actually know, and we're trying to communicate this, what we really need, I think, is now for the investors, the people whose hands are on the money, the investors and the decision makers, to grasp this more broadly, because I think ultimately they will benefit, their constituents will benefit, and ultimately the politicians that bring these things to force will benefit because their public will see that and will hopefully keep them in office.
So how do you think we can convince these investors?
Well, we've been talking till we're frankly blue in the face, and we've been pleased that a number of doors have been opened for us. But one of the things that, I think we just have to keep repeating these messages over and over again. The forum right now is great. One of the things that we're doing is we've realized that if you want to talk to anybody who's under 20 years of age and you want to hold their attention, you probably better be communicating to them through some kind of electronic device. So we're now producing 2-minute and 3-minute videos. 3 minutes we think is probably the peak concentration period for someone of that age, which actually distill down a lot of these kinds of key messages. So we're actually trying, we're welcome any and all suggestions, but we do spend a lot of time talking and communicating and trying to engage in outreach. I think there's a great deal of work in front of us because ultimately it's in the interests of the nations that are trying to optimize their development. It is in their interest to have these more sustainable and more broad-based kinds of solutions for their infrastructure problems, rather than, quite frankly, what we're seeing is a great mix, a great diversity, some good, some pretty ordinary, and some, frankly, not good at all.
Thanks for that. I have one more question for you, Professor Lawrence, and that is, what is the most important thing that tropical countries can do from an infrastructure perspective to help preserve biodiversity?
Well, the thing that we say, and it's true, it's what we call avoid the first cut. People don't particularly like this analogy, but the perfect analogy of putting a road into a deep forest area or an area of intact habitat is cancer. You put the road in, deforestation is intensely, or habitat destruction or poaching or degradation, it's intensely contagious spatially. And what that means is if you put a road into some wilderness area, a national park or some protected area, deforestation proliferates just like a series of tumors. It starts growing, and then what you get is all these secondary and tertiary roads, which are often illegal. And so the cancer spreads, it metastasizes and it spreads. Around the world, there's an incredibly strong relationship. In the Amazon, this is something we've done a very systematic analysis. 95% of all deforestation in the Amazon basin occurs within 5.5 kilometers of a road, okay? 5.5 kilometers of a road, 95%. You want to know where the deforestation is? You want to know where it's going to happen in the future? Just say where are the roads or where the road's going to go. Also, for every 1 kilometer of legal road, there's 3 kilometers of illegal roads, okay? So again and again, what you see is a legal road gets put in, and then this whole spider web of illegal roads gets put in. So, classic example, the first highway that was put in the Brazilian Amazon, it was just a razor thin cut through the forest. It was supposed to be a 1,200 kilometer long highway, and that today, completed in the 1970s, that today is about a 400 kilometer wide slash of forest destruction across the eastern Brazilian Amazon. Almost all the resources that came out of that, the timber, most of it was stolen. Very little of it was realized by the government. It was basically timber theft. It was land theft. It was out of control frontier situation. It's another reason why the governments want to be able to control these processes is because in many cases, there's very large problems with illegal activities, especially around timber theft, poaching activity, some cases drug production, other things that are not in the interests of nations to lose. Money's not going into health and to public services and into welfare and government coffers. It's going into individuals who are robbing the system. So having a proper design over the infrastructure provides the optimal opportunity for the governments to set a trajectory of development that's going to be much more sustainable than if they just have a more carefree, careless, Wild West kind of approach, which it saddens me to say is the status quo far more often than I would like to see. I think there's a great deal of potential for improvement. Hopefully, we will see this happening because I think it's perhaps the single most important thing we could do to improve sustainability and to improve the environment.
Thanks for your insight, Professor Lawrence. Now, in terms of trade investment, Mr. Gosper, what do you see as Australia's and other ASEAN nations' roles in tropical development?
Well, I mean, there's a range of issues that are relevant here into keeping economies and societies working properly. I mean, You need to invest heavily in research and excellence, and that's what we're doing. James Cook is a big part of that. And share it with others. So that's tremendously important. I think connectivity is really quite essential. And that's connectivity across the region. So one of the things we've just done is we've appointed an ambassador for regional health security. So someone who can actually engage with the region, talk about best practice, share, cooperate, all those sorts of things. So I think that's tremendously important. And in that context, I think there's a lot that Australia and Singapore can do in this region. I mean, there are things that we offer that Singapore doesn't have. We're much better at delivering programs in the region, for instance. But Singapore's got terrific capability to help us bring into operation and to market a lot of the excellent research and design that is undertaken in Australia. So there's a lot to be done there. I mean, of course, keep markets open. It's something that we shouldn't have to say, but we do have to say, particularly given some of the things that we see observed more recently. Now, that's all markets for all products, but particularly for societies here which are looking to grow their economies and to lift living standards. It's tremendously important that we keep markets open, and it's in our own hands to do that. There's lots of ways to do it, but we've got to keep talking to the populations and pointing out why it is so important that we keep markets open for trade and for investment, for the movement of ideas and people and so forth. So others might want a different sort of approach, but we have to keep doing our part and indeed take a leadership role on keeping markets open. And a couple of other things that are in the same vein, I'd say. Climate, of course, is a very difficult issue, but very important in the region for the reasons talked. I mean, a multilateral approach where everyone was involved is certainly preferable, but if others want to take a different approach, we have to make sure that we're doing our part to actually ensure that action is taken on climate and that we really embed that in our approaches in the region. And I guess the only other thing I'd say in this context is gender. Gender is a tremendously important part of the Sustainable Development Goals. You can't develop or see societies developed if half the population is not empowered to play their proper role in society. So really ensuring that issue is addressed is part of really what we should be talking about and giving attention to as well.
Now, you touched on the fact that more and more countries are looking inward. How do you think that will impact the tropics?
Well, it won't be good. It's a very competitive world. People have got big cohorts of population who want a lift in their living standards. They want to be able to have a meal on the table. They want basic health care. They want their children to have education. They want to live in a decent environment. They want some leisure. It's not going to happen unless economies develop, unless some of the fundamental problems are addressed, and unless economies develop in a sustainable fashion. And that really requires attention to the way in which this region operates. If countries turn in on themselves, then you're not going to see the right path to development in the region. You're going to see the opposite. So I think it's tremendously important, if you want to see development, that we keep talking to people about how these issues need to be addressed in an open world where technology and ideas and capital and trade need to keep moving freely.
I have two more questions for you, which I'll ask together since they are related. And they are, what can tropical Australia in particular and Southeast Asia learn from one another? And what do you think are the largest opportunities for the tropics from an international relations perspective?
It's me. Okay. Well, I've spoken a little bit about what the work we're doing in research, and they're important things for us to be doing. I mean, investment. I mean, William has spoken at some length about the importance of getting investment right. So we're looking at that in Australia as well. We want investment, and we've learnt very quickly that you don't get investment unless you've got proper planning of a project and you're able to present to an investor essentially an investment-ready project design. People aren't going to invest in things otherwise. So there's plenty of capital around, but people are more inclined to be cautious rather than waste their money on some of these things. So we're doing that. In fact, we're having an investment forum in northern Queensland later this year, where again we'll invite a lot of people from the region and indeed globally to look at investment in specific projects in northern Australia. And some of it's around investment in tropical health and those sorts of areas. And I think it's a good approach. It sort of, we're very happy to engage others in the region about what that means and share experiences. And, you know, I think there's doing well on that front will also set a good model, I think, for the rest of the region.
Thanks for that. My final question for each panelist is, are you optimistic about the future for the tropics? And do you believe that we can, in fact, achieve the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals? Perhaps we can start with Dr. Espino.
Yes, I am very optimistic despite the challenges, because there are obviously initiatives and advocacies initiatives such as this, having the International Day of the Tropics, calling attention to specific and unique problems which the countries in the tropics face. The Millennium Development Goal was something which we really needed in terms of world health. The other one now is the Sustainable Development Goal, which looks now at government investments and making it more collaborative. And also, there are a lot of funding initiatives, such as the Global Fund. It has done a lot for TB, malaria, and HIV in countries that have these Global Fund grants. Yes, there are some. It lacks in some areas, but in overall, it has done very well. And also, there are quite a lot of groups that are looking towards disease elimination. One is the APMEN, and which is under now the APOMA. And it's the only initiative in this region which is drawing attention to the unique problems that are seen in countries in this area. And also, I also believe that the current technology could actually be maximized for use. One is the unmanned aerial vehicles, the drones. They're not only for military purposes. They have a lot of use for vector-borne diseases. One could be, it can monitor land use change. It has not yet been used in this aspect, but it can be used to monitor land use change. And why? Because with land use change, you're going to have disease outbreaks. And governments, and this is a cheap way to monitor. You do not need any internet connection. And also, the other tools which have been used before, like satellite remote sensing maps, which could also be used for health. And so many other new technology. You have handheld device, GPS devices. Yeah, all of these can be tapped. So I'm very optimistic. And also the fact that, yeah, we're sitting together and talking as one. I mean, this is instead of, yeah. Thank you.
Great, thanks for that, Dr. Espino. Professor Lawrence?
Well, I don't think we have any choice but to be optimistic. And even if we're not optimistic, we just have to say we're optimistic. The analogy I might use... That's
not very optimistic.
Yeah, the analogy I might use is we're walking on a tightrope, and we've got to keep our eye on the objective ahead. We probably don't want to spend too much time looking down. I think we know what we need to do. I think we know where we need to go. And there's no real sense saying it's helpless. The world is going to be what it is, and if we throw up our hands and say it's for naught, it's going to just be worse. I do think that there's enormous potential for things to go north or south or somewhere in between right now, and I think we in fact see plenty of warning signs. The Sustainable Development Goals are very useful in that they provide a series of signposts, but they're idealized. And in fact, when you look at them closely, what you actually see is that some Sustainable Development Goals are actually, to some degree, clash with other ones. I mean, they don't, if you try to achieve all of them, it's a little bit, sometimes they're inconsistent. And some of them can clash with, for instance, plans around infrastructure. But the bottom line is, yes, I'm optimistic because we don't have any choice but to be optimistic.
Yeah, of course, I'm Australian, so I'm tremendously optimistic. And again, talking about this region, where else would you rather be? You know, it's a really fascinating part of the world. It's growing, probably growing better than any other part of the world. Sure, there are challenges and there are issues that need to be addressed, but there is a lot of good things happening as well. There's a sort of sense of connectivity. I think ASEAN is a terrific strength, and it provides connectivity. There's a receptiveness to cooperation. There are good partners who are applying good research and good money, and there are good people wanting to do good. So I think every bit of optimism is encouraged.
Thanks for that. We still have some time now, so I'd like to now open the floor to questions from the audience. Do we have any microphones out there? Okay, maybe you take. So if you have a question, can you please state your name, which organization you're from, and who you're directing the question at to the panel? Very shy audience.
I have questions. Oh, yes. We've all got questions. We're just waiting.
All right.
All right. I mean, I'm not an academic. I come from the media industry, lifestyle industry, and all of that. And I am very fascinated by everything that's been said today and the fact that you actually have this amazing study. So how do you, and I address this to all the panel because we're talking about optimism and looking for the warning signs and all those kinds of things. How do you transfer what you see on the pages of this into reality? I just thought I'd throw it out there.
Yeah, who would like to start?
Yeah, because it's one thing to see it on paper, and then how do we actually make policies or guidelines or change the course of what's actually happening in the tropics?
I mean, that's the trick, Anita, is trying to, firstly, I think we are attempting to do this. And there's a challenge of trying to communicate these concepts, so we've got to get those out there. And then, it's really a matter of, and I don't have the answer. We need a lot of help in terms of communicating these ideas, disseminating these ideas, and getting them across. I guess the good news is, I think when we start talking to decision makers about a lot of this, in fact, they can see that it's in their own interests, even to the degree of saying, I want to stay in office. It's in their own interests. And if you can't, you're not really going to get anywhere with policies unless it somehow plays off enlightened self-interest. So it really is, I think, a matter of clarifying and communicating that. So media can help a great deal in this kind of thing, of course. But
Hashtag State of the Tropics.
Yeah. Every means possible, but we have to communicate at all levels. It's not just, of course, to the top down, it's bottom up, and it's all directions. But I think that you've put your finger on what is really the challenge for us is relatively enlightened audience here, right? I mean, by and large, connected, well-educated, thoughtful group of people. And now we step outside these doors and we're going to encounter a lot of other people who are just more preoccupied with their, say, day-to-day. And the question is, how do we communicate that? And I don't have an answer, but I do know that it's really critical that we try to do that.
Thank you.
Professor Harding, I think, had a question. Or yeah.
You make Ken Hickson's my name. I'm a sustainability consultant, but I'm also involved in the media and communicating as well. And I can't agree more that this is so important to communicate. What seems to be the case, and I haven't read the report yet, and I know certainly of the good work that JCU and others are doing, there doesn't seem to be a very strong focus on the tropics. When you consider that 40% of the world lives in the tropics, is it because only a small part of America is actually in the tropics? Is it because there is European presence in terms of some countries in the tropics are certainly associated with France and Britain, etc., and the other Commonwealth countries. But there does seem to be sort of a bit of, I was going to say, political ignorance or lack of awareness of what is going on in the tropics. And I haven't read the report, but I'm certainly conscious of the fact that I'm sure it's telling us there are a lot of things happening, and is a lot of increasing awareness, but there is certainly a need to communicate and get to the people who are going to fund the infrastructure, as well as get more happening within the region. The one point, and I won't take up any more time, I'm conscious of is not only the hard infrastructure, but the soft infrastructure that's very necessary. And one economic development that's very important, I think, in the tropics is tourism. And I'm sure it's mentioned in the report, but that is something that I think we need to focus more on in terms of making sure the soft and hard infrastructure is there, so all the countries in the tropics get the benefit of tourism and avoid the bad consequences that can sometimes happen with development. So just maybe my question is, how much more could we be doing to focus on the economic opportunities that come from developing the infrastructure, soft and hard, in the tropics?
Maybe Mr. Gosper, would you like to answer that?
Yeah, well, I certainly feel from an Australian perspective that we're giving a lot of attention to it. It's part of has been for quite some years now, part of our discourse around the development of parts of Australia and the region. Maybe we don't conceptualise it always as the tropics, but it's certainly in the tropics, and we understand the problems that are there that come about from that, and we're certainly given attention. I mean, this work is quite important because no one country, no one researcher, no one institution has all the answers, and this work that has been done connects a big part of the world, and there's perfect opportunity for collaboration. When we get people together on, say, developments on malaria, you get people from Toronto, you get people from Bern, you get people from Melbourne, so the opportunity to draw all those sorts of people together is quite important. So maybe it can be better communicated, but I think reports like this are a pretty good start, and we're beginning to get a lot more attention.
Professor Honey?
If I could just make a comment on that. In fact, that was very much the genesis of this whole program, was an understanding that we tend to view the world as geopolitically as north and south and east and west and developing Asia, the rest. And what we'd forgotten really is this fundamental, it's an Aristotelian conception of a lateral idea of the world, and common climate, common geography, very diverse communities, very diverse cultures. But because there are those commonalities as well, there are common challenges and opportunities that we need to be paying attention to. So that's part of why the project is here. So just a comment there on that. I guess, in a way, my question or comment goes to where Anita was too. And I was just struck that all of you, really, Carol, Effie, I think everybody on the panel talked about the role of government, but also good governance in the tropics, and the ease, perhaps, with which good policy can be formulated, and the difficulty, and we see it in all nations, it's not a factor of the tropics, the difficulty of implementation and then funding that good policy. And I guess, where I was going to go with the question was just any insights about good governance. In the work on the state of the tropics, we've looked at good governance, and it's plain that there's a direct relationship between good governance and economic prosperity. It's absolutely plain, and development and education. So I guess any insights that you would have from your various perspectives about that, what that good governance looks like, or what advice would you provide in order to try and secure the sort of implementation and budget outcomes that we know are so sorely needed, not just in the tropics, but across the world?
Well, maybe I could say a couple of things. It is important. First of all, it's important that it's not just governments, it's business and NGOs and community groups that need to be involved in designing good programs. Secondly, and it's sort of come up a little bit with respect to big projects. I mean, there's a lot of talk about big amounts of money being put into projects of one sort or another. Really, good planning, transparency, predictability, openness are really important for that money to be spent well, because otherwise you do get a lot of dead money that's spent on things that don't have an impact. I think open consultation about program design. Lots of people have good ideas, but they usually fail in implementation. So, and this is a problem for all governments, developed or developing. So that's quite important, and you know, we're all struggling with more complex societies, all of us, and one of the messages that is often coming through is that incremental or pilot projects often have more of an impact in demonstrating the efficacy of a particular program or idea, and that sort of buys on wider support that can lead to a more effective outcome in the end. So those are some things I'd say.
Okay, Bruce handed me the microphone. Sandra, I suppose the one thing I would say about governance would be, and obviously big, complicated issue, I think transparency in the sense of probably having an open media as much as possible. I think a lot of these issues around shadowy governance tend to thrive in the dark. And when you shine a light on these situations, you tend to find that it's more difficult for, shall we say, shady transactions and other things to go awry. Now, it's more complicated than that. I can think of countries that have huge governance challenges and have quite an open and vigorous media, and I can think of countries that have big governance challenges and don't have a very open media. So maybe I'm just debating with myself right now, but my gut tells me that having a more open opportunities for more open public discourse is going to be one of the keys to trying to combat poor governance and graft and corruption, because I think people fundamentally feel it's unfair and it's intolerant. And I've lived and worked so many years in developing nations where what you see is somebody gets elected and then mysteriously they somehow become very wealthy. And you just see it again and again and again. And I think, you know, it's as though questions get asked, but they get asked in sort of this hushed tone of voice. The question is, why not ask it openly? Where did that, you know, I can tell you a former governor, I lived in Manaus, Brazil for a number of years. Guy who was a mayor of Manaus became very astonishingly wealthy. Well, how did that happen? And it wasn't, you know, everyone talked about it, but nobody, why isn't that a subject of an expose? Anyway, my small contribution to that conversation would be, I think openness and conversation is going to be part of the solution.
I agree with that. When we had a very big problematic dengue outbreak a few years ago, there were no demonstrations on the street. We had about 70,000 cases of dengue in a few, I think half a year, and that was really, and the case fatality rate was more than 1%. And I think that's because people were struggling to deal with the problem. So people were really focused on how do I overcome this, what do I do? So it's really complicated, and I also agree, yes, well, for the Philippines, because there's so many pressing problems and priorities, you have to say, which do I do first? We should be able to manage our time. I come from a research institute, but the research output we want to do is not as we expect, because we work very closely with the programs, the national programs, and that by itself gives us a lot of work to do. So the research takes a backside. We're so much involved with the surveillance work. And the other one with projects, that is, I think I think there should be a study on the amount of investments put in health development projects and what is the impact. I've had personal experiences with working with projects which had millions of dollars invested, but you don't see the impact. And I think it's because there is no involvement of stakeholders from the start. There is no room for negotiation of stakeholders in saying, okay, can we not do it this way? And it's difficult because when somebody goes you with this much money, I'm honest, you'll say, okay, yes, we'll do it that way. There is no room for it. And it's also the problem on the receiving side. I'll say again, empowerment. Yeah, perhaps we have to be more empowered. and among ourselves talk about this more. So yeah, it's being able to negotiate, having that empowerment to negotiate.
Thanks to all the panel for your views on that. Any more questions?
Hi, Associate Professor Anita Lundberg, James Cook University, Singapore. I'm just referring back to the question that was asked earlier about the tropics and the region of the tropics. Essentially, it's always been there. It's been a little bit hidden under the notion of the global south. So in developmental discourses, we've been dealing with the global north, which we've assumed is rich, and the global south, put under this huge banner of the global south. It's not all of the global south, of course, but they were basically in development discourses referring to Asia, Latin America, Africa, and of course the Pacific. So that by pointing out that that's actually this tropical region, we can then point out that it's got these particular specificities about nature and about the cultures within those regions. So it's always been there. It's just been hidden under this idea that it's lower than the north. Just a comment.
All right. Well, thanks to all, and please join me in welcoming, in thanking the panel. Now I'll hand it back to Anita.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our panelists once again for a truly engaging experience, and of course, to the very talented Andrew Chu for moderating the panel and finishing exactly on the dot of 2:45. I am so impressed. I have so much to learn from you. My takeaway, and I'm sure you probably share a little bit of this with me as well, is that we're obviously dealing with a very dynamic thing. The state of the tropics is very dynamic, and we're talking about practical optimism, because I'm optimistic too, but in a very practical way. Staying the course, reading the warning signs, and of course we all want action. And action really comes from, yes, the media. We'll have to do something about that. It's about openness, leading to accountability, and that in itself should hopefully also lead to action. But I'm just really, really proud to have been here to help launch this. I had absolutely no idea about the paper. I felt, as I said, when I spoke with Anne and when we had our meeting yesterday, that I felt delightfully ignorant. And I, as a member of the media, will certainly be spreading the word. Ladies and gentlemen, those of you here in Singapore, in Cairns, is Cairns over there in that camera? Hi! I think you should just pan the room. Pan the room so everyone can see everyone here. Come on, that's the way we do it. Dynamic, state of the tropics. Townsville, Mount Isa. I'm very sorry I called you Mount Isa earlier. I'm really sorry. I am sorry. Please forgive me. Don't hashtag me badly. Across the world, thank you once again for engaging with this event to celebrate the second ever United Nations International Day of the Tropics. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals have a particular character in the tropics, and their achievement or otherwise will be largely played out there and here in our places. We now know that there is a deep and abiding need to develop infrastructure and capacity in the tropics. This matters deeply in the tropics and in the rest of the world. This great challenge certainly deserves all of our attention. As the State of the Tropics program has comprehensively demonstrated, in no small way, the future of the world depends on the tropics. And the capacity of this critical part of the world to develop and prosper depends on our capacity to secure sustainable development with, for, and in the tropics. Many thanks again to each and every one of you for being with us here on for this very important event. And for those who will like to remain in the room, please enjoy tea, coffee, conversation. Our panelists will be with us for a little while more. And for those elsewhere in the world, what a privilege to have you with all of us here today. Farewell to all of you, and remember, if you're hashtagging, it's State of the Tropics, We Are the Tropics, and there is no hashtag that says Anita could not pronounce Isa. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Do you know when it was?